The room smells like warm tape and dusted wood. A piano bench creaks under old weight. Scuffed floorboards carry footprints that never quite fade. The lights hum, low and tired, while reels spin with a nervous wobble. On the wall, a clock ticks just off tempo, as if time itself can't agree on the beat. This is Studio 2, late summer 1969, and something final is being stitched together. They don't sound like four friends anymore. They sound like fragments being forced into a single breath. Voices enter, vanish, then return from another door entirely. Melodies feel borrowed from earlier lives, and every handoff feels deliberate. Here's the reframe. The Abbey Road medley isn't a collection of songs. It's a controlled collapse designed to look seamless. So is it a farewell built on unity, or proof that unity was already gone? By the time the Abbey Road medley took shape, the Beatles were no longer operating like a band. They were operating like a deadline. Business arguments circled every session, egos collided, and communication often happened through tape rather than conversation. What brought them back into the same room wasn't harmony, it was strategy. The idea to link unfinished pieces into one continuous suite came largely from George Martin. After the chaos of earlier sessions, he wanted control. Short fragments could be polished, glued together, and elevated into something bigger than their parts. For a group splintering at the seams, the medley was a workaround. Less debate, fewer full band battles, more surgical precision. There's an eerie claim that the medley feels guided, like an unseen hand is moving the band through doors they didn't know existed. The grounded explanation is simpler. Martin's classical training. He thought in movements, not tracks. The verdict stays open because the effect is undeniable. Once "You Never Give Me Your Money" begins, stopping feels wrong, almost forbidden. Studio 2 mattered. The room had height, natural reverb, and a familiarity built over years. The band knew exactly how far a piano note would carry before dissolving into air. That physical knowledge created continuity where emotional continuity was missing. When fans say the medley feels alive, they're responding to acoustics, not ghosts, but the sensation still lands. And then there's authorship. Paul McCartney pushed hardest for the medley structure, while John Lennon famously dismissed parts of it as bits. That tension leaks into the music. Bright melodies slam into darker turns. Hopeful lines collapse into unresolved chords. It sounds intentional because it was, but not in the way fans like to imagine. Scale paragraph, verified numbers, 9 song fragments, 16 minutes of continuous music, recorded across roughly 2 months in 1969. 8-track tape machines pushed near their limits, dozens of razor blade edits. One final album before the breakup became official. Some listeners swear the seamless flow proves unity at the end. Others hear a farewell stitched together by necessity. Both interpretations survive because the medley never tells you which one is right. And that ambiguity is the hook, because once you hear how carefully this was assembled, the next question becomes unavoidable. What else inside the medley was designed to hide in plain sight? The strangest thing about the Abbey Road medley isn't how it begins. It's how little resistance there is between endings. Songs don't stop, they dissolve. One melody thins out, another slides in, and your brain accepts it without protest. That sensation is where the unease starts. Fans have long claimed there's something unnatural about those transitions, like the band is stepping through hidden doors. One rumor insists the shifts feel too smooth to be human, as if the music is being guided forward by something unseen. The grounded explanation is far less mystical, but just as unsettling. Razor blades, tape loops, and brutal precision. Engineers physically cut tape and splice sections together, sometimes frame by frame. What feels like flow is actually violence done carefully. Listen closely to how themes reappear. A piano figure echoes earlier heartbreak. A lyric about money bleeds into exhaustion, then into resignation. This has fueled speculation that the medley is a coded confession, an intentional summing up of everything the band couldn't say out loud. The practical counterpoint is that many fragments were unfinished songs. Linking them wasn't symbolism, it was efficiency. Still, efficiency doesn't explain why the emotional arc feels so complete. There's also the persistent claim that time behaves oddly inside the medley. Listeners swear it feels shorter than it is, like minutes are being compressed. No paranormal forces required here. This is a known psychological effect. Continuous music without clear breaks reduces time awareness, but knowing that doesn't fully dispel the feeling. Your body knows something unusual is happening, even when your brain has an answer. Tension between writers adds another layer. Paul McCartney favored polish and narrative shape. John Lennon leaned toward raw statements and abrupt endings. In the medley, those philosophies collide. Sweet resolution is immediately undercut. Uplift is followed by decay. Fans sometimes read this as intentional duality, almost like two voices arguing inside one body. Historically, that's accurate, but not mystical. It's the sound of a partnership failing in real time. One of the most unsettling beliefs is that the medley feels like it's closing a loop, not just an album. That it quietly references earlier Beatles eras, pulling the past into the present before shutting the door. The rational view is simple. Musicians reuse shapes they know work. But when those shapes line up this cleanly, coincidence starts to feel thin. By the time the final section approaches, you're no longer listening for individual songs. You're waiting for release. And that's when the question shifts from how this was built to why it needed to end this way at all. There's a moment in the medley where the music feels crowded, like too many thoughts trying to exit the same door. Harmonies overlap. Lines answer each other before the first one is finished. This is where rumors begin to cluster, because listeners swear they hear more than what's written. One persistent claim is that faint voices sit beneath the main vocals, murmurs, half phrases, breaths that don't belong to anyone at the mic. Some fans go further, suggesting these are deliberate, hidden messages, layered to speak directly to those listening closely enough. The grounded explanation points to multi-track bounce downs. As tracks were combined to free up space, earlier takes bled into the background. Tape hiss, room noise, and discarded vocals survived the cuts, technically accidental. Emotionally, harder to dismiss. Another unsettling detail is how often the medley shifts perspective. One line feels confessional. The next sounds detached, almost judgmental. This has led to speculation that the medley isn't a single narrator, but several internal voices arguing for control. The historical explanation fits neatly. Different writers, different emotional states, recorded weeks apart, stitched into one spine. Yet when those perspectives alternate this quickly, it starts to feel less like collaboration and more like fracture. Some listeners insist certain phrases predict outcomes, careers ending, relationships breaking, futures narrowing. These interpretations thrive because the lyrics are vague enough to invite projection. Psychologically, this is pattern-seeking behavior. When we know a breakup is coming, we search backward for signs. But the discomfort lingers because many of those lines were written before the end was officially decided. Prediction or coincidence remains unresolved. There's also the eerie sensation that the medley listens back. People describe feeling watched by the music, as if it anticipates emotional responses before they happen. No mystery required here. Dynamic shifts are engineered to do exactly that. Volume drops pull you in. Sudden crescendos trigger alertness. It's basic audio psychology. Still, when manipulation is this effective, it can feel personal. Scale paragraph, verified numbers. Over 30 vocal tracks layered across the medley, multiple generations of tape bounce downs, frequencies stacked within a narrow mid-range, sections recorded days, and sometimes weeks, apart. One continuous emotional arc formed from fragments never meant to touch. The deeper you listen, the harder it becomes to separate intention from accident. Were these buried sounds meant to survive? Or are they ghosts of decisions abandoned mid-session? The medley never clarifies. And as those voices fade into the next movement, another realization creeps in. Maybe the most important things here aren't sung at all. They're what the band chose not to say out loud. By the time listeners reach the back half of the medley, something familiar starts to feel wrong. Lines sound double-edged. Endings don't resolve cleanly. And that's where one of the most persistent theories resurfaces. The idea that the medley quietly nods to the "Paul is dead" rumor without ever naming it. Fans point to fragments that feel funereal, a sudden drop in energy, lyrics that hint at endings rather than conclusions. The claim is that these moments are deliberate winks, placed for those already looking for proof. The grounded explanation is far less dramatic. The band was writing from exhaustion. Themes of loss, debt, and closure were already dominating their work in 1969. When you stack those themes back to back, they naturally sound like mourning. Still, some details are hard to ignore. The way certain phrases feel final rather than temporary. The repetition of "carry that weight," which listeners interpret as a burden being passed on. Believers argue this is symbolic confirmation. Historians counter that it's autobiographical, about legal disputes, creative pressure, and the weight of holding the group together. Both readings survive because the lyrics never commit to either. There's also a technical aspect that fuels the mystery. Vocals are treated differently here: thicker reverb, less intimacy, more distance. To some, that distance suggests absence, like a voice already stepping away. The practical reason lies in production choices. Reverb was used to glue disparate recordings into one space. But emotionally, distance still reads as distance, no matter the cause. Another rumor claims certain transitions are intentionally abrupt to break the spell, as if the medley is daring listeners to notice the seams. The rational view is simpler. Not every fragment fit cleanly. Some cuts were compromises, not codes. Yet those compromises became part of the legend because they interrupt comfort at just the wrong moment. What makes this section unsettling isn't the theory itself, it's how easily the music accommodates it. You don't have to force the interpretation, it slides in naturally, especially if you already know the myth. That's how powerful ambiguity works. It doesn't convince you, it invites you. From a historical lens, The band was painfully aware of the rumor by this point and publicly dismissed it. Sneaking confirmations into their final album would have made no practical sense. And yet, artists are rarely as rational as historians want them to be. Art absorbs tension, whether intended or not. So when the medley presses forward, carrying unresolved weight into its next movement, the question sharpens. Are these echoes intentional messages left behind, or just the unavoidable sound of a band being mythologized while it was still breathing? Halfway through the medley, something shifts. The music stops feeling emotional and starts feeling organized, not warm, controlled. This is where many listeners sense an invisible authority taking over, as if the songs are being marched into position rather than performed freely. The rumor is that the medley represents a final power grab, that one vision overrides all others, forcing fragments into alignment to present a unified ending the band didn't actually feel. Some even frame it as musical domination, proof that harmony was manufactured, not lived. The grounded explanation is far more practical. Someone had to make decisions. With time running out and patience gone, structure became survival. What's unsettling is how effective that structure is. Each segment enters exactly when the previous one would otherwise collapse. Silence is avoided at all costs. There's no room to breathe. That has led to speculation that the medley is intentionally suffocating, mirroring how the band felt trapped by contracts, expectations, and each other. Historically, that reading holds water. The sessions were tense, legal disputes loomed, and every creative choice felt final. Some listeners claim the medley induces a strange emotional obedience. You don't question where it's going, you follow. Psychologically, this is explained by tonal continuity. Keys are chosen to minimize friction. Tempos are matched, so your nervous system never resets. No paranormal influence required. But the result still feels manipulative in the purest sense of the word. There's also the belief that the medley erases individual identity. Standalone songs allow personality to dominate. Here, personalities blur. That's been interpreted as symbolic death of ego, of the band's earlier selves. The historical counter is simple. Fragments don't leave room for ego. They're too short, too focused. Yet when you remove identity long enough, absence becomes noticeable. Scale paragraph, verified numbers. Over 40 manual edits across the medley. Less than 2 seconds of silence between most transitions. Keys engineered to move stepwise, not abruptly. Final mix compressed to maintain constant presence. Zero traditional fade-outs until the very end. Another eerie claim suggests the medley conditions the listener, training them to accept loss before it arrives. By the time the final section hits, you're already prepared. That's not mysticism. That's narrative pacing. But emotional conditioning doesn't feel technical when you're inside it. It feels personal. What makes this section linger is the contradiction it exposes. The medley sounds unified because unity was missing. Control steps in when trust disappears. And the tighter the grip becomes, the more impressive the illusion looks. As the music pushes forward, one realization starts to harden. This isn't just a creative decision, it's a coping mechanism. And what comes next isn't about control at all. It's about surrender.
The first thing Halston felt when he was pulled from the freezing waters was warmth. It was not a luxury he had known in hours, maybe longer. His body, still in shock from the cold, barely registered the change at first. But as he was hauled into the rescue aircraft, The rush of heat from the cabin enveloped him, and his numb limbs slowly began to regain feeling. His teeth stopped chattering. His muscles, tight from hours of freezing exposure, loosened bit by bit. The immediate threat of death was gone, but the toll was far from over. Halston's mind was a haze. His vision swam, and his body felt like it didn't belong to him anymore. His limbs ached with each shallow breath. He could hear voices, muffled at first, then growing clearer. The rescue crew had already begun working to revive him, wrapping him in blankets, slipping IV fluids into his veins, trying to force life back into a man who had nearly been swallowed by the cold. Halston's body was shaking, but it wasn't just from the frostbite anymore. It was a deep, lingering fatigue that had set into his very bones, a kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but emotional. He had survived the ditching. He had made it out of the water, but he wasn't sure yet if he was ready to face what came next. The rescue team moved quickly, applying their expertise to stabilize him. Halston could barely keep his eyes open, his body aching for rest, but there was something gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. The mission hadn't been about him. It had been about the squadron, about the bombers. He had sacrificed everything to save them, and now, as his body slowly regained strength, the reality of what he had done began to settle in. What had happened to the rest of his squadron? What happened to the bombers? Had his desperate actions worked? The question lingered in the back of his mind, but there was no immediate answer. All he knew was that he was alive, and that was a miracle in itself. When they finally landed back at base, Halston was escorted to a medical tent where doctors tended to the frostbite on his hands and feet, as well as the bruises and cuts from the crash. The pain was sharp, but he barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, still reliving the seconds of the fight, the split-second decisions he had made, the feeling of the plane diving toward the water. Then he was surrounded by his squadron members. They entered the tent in groups, some walking, others being carried in on stretchers. But when they saw him, there was a collective pause, some in disbelief, some in awe. There was no grand speech, no fanfare. Halston wasn't the type to seek glory, and his comrades knew it. But the looks on their faces told him everything he needed to know. "You saved us," one of the younger pilots said, his voice thick with emotion. Halston didn't have the words to respond. How could he? He had done what was necessary to give them a fighting chance, but the cost of that decision was more than just the physical toll. He had sacrificed a part of himself that day. That was something he'd carry with him forever. The debriefing was almost an afterthought. The mission had been chaotic, and the loss of Halston's aircraft had nearly led to disaster. But what wasn't immediately clear was how crucial his sacrifice had been. Halston's actions in diverting the German fighters away from the bomber formation had been the key to preventing a devastating attack. His decision to ditch his plane had allowed the rest of the squadron to return safely, especially the bombers, who had been the primary target. Later reports confirmed that thanks to Halston's diversion, the bombers had suffered minimal damage. The squadron had lost one plane, but the mission had been a success in the end. It was a bittersweet victory. Halston's courage and selflessness had saved lives, but the emotional weight of that victory was heavy. In the weeks that followed, Halston would rarely speak of what had happened. He wasn't one for boasting or recognition, but what he didn't realize at the time was that the legacy of his actions would endure far beyond that single mission. His story would circulate through the ranks, an example of bravery, sacrifice, and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. But perhaps the most poignant thing was the quiet reflection among the men of his squadron. They all knew that on any given day, it could have been any one of them making that ultimate decision. In war, survival wasn't just about skill in the air. It was about the ability to make life and death choices in a heartbeat. Halston had done that, and in doing so, he had saved them all. Though Halston's bravery would go on to be remembered by his fellow pilots, there were still untold stories and unknown details about what truly happened in those final moments of the mission. The legacy of that day, and what it meant for the future of the squadron, would reveal more than anyone had anticipated.
Just when the medley convinces you it has settled, it pivots. Not sharply, quietly. This is the stretch where listeners realize the calm was never the destination. It was cover. Beneath the smoother melodies, there's a tightening grip, a sense that something unresolved is being dragged into the light without announcement. A long-standing claim says this part of the medley functions like a verdict, that earlier themes are weighed, judged, and returned with consequences. Believers point to how motifs resurface altered, brighter on the surface, heavier underneath. The grounded explanation is thematic recapitulation, a classical technique that revisits ideas with variation. No hidden judge required. Still, when familiar phrases come back changed, the effect feels personal, like a reckoning you didn't agree to attend. There's also the belief that the music begins to speak back here, that it answers the listener's expectations and then denies them. Psychologically, this tracks. Anticipation is set up, then deliberately subverted. When a cadence promises closure and swerves away, the brain flags it as meaningful. But meaning doesn't require intention to feel real. Some fans hear exhaustion encoded into the sound, performances that feel drained rather than triumphant. They argue this proves the medley isn't celebratory at all. It's a mass confession of burnout. Historically, that reading aligns with reality. The sessions were efficient, not joyful. Takes were clean, not playful. What sounds polished can also sound tired, depending on where you stand. A more paranormal interpretation suggests this section carries a weight that listeners feel physically: tight chest, held breath, delayed release. The rational explanation lives in arrangement. Sustained chords increase physiological tension. Delayed resolution prolongs stress responses. But again, the body doesn't care why it's reacting. It only knows that it is. Scale paragraph, verified numbers. Multiple key changes within a short span. Phrases repeated with reduced instrumentation. Dynamic range narrowed to maintain pressure. Transitions timed within seconds of expected resolution. Emotional payoff delayed across minutes, not moments. What's unsettling is how openly this reckoning hides. There's no dramatic signal, no obvious warning. The medley doesn't announce that it's passing judgment. It just does it, calmly, efficiently, and without appeal. That's why interpretation splits so cleanly. Some hear accountability, others hear punishment. Both reactions are valid because the music never clarifies its intent. From a historical perspective, this ambiguity mirrors the band's final months. Everyone knew something was ending. No one agreed on what that ending meant. The medley absorbs that disagreement and turns it into structure. Not chaos, order, order sharp enough to cut. As this section dissolves, one final thought starts to surface. If this was the reckoning, then what's left isn't explanation or defense. It's aftermath. And aftermath, when rendered honestly, rarely sounds the way people expect it to. After the reckoning passes, the medley doesn't rush to comfort you. It lingers in a strange emotional vacuum, lighter than before, but not free. This is the aftermath phase, and it's where many listeners feel most disoriented. There's no victory lap, no clear signal that the journey meant what you thought it meant. A common belief is that this section represents survival rather than success, that the music isn't celebrating an ending, it's simply acknowledging that something made it through. Fans who lean into this reading describe the tone as cautiously optimistic, like relief mixed with disbelief. The grounded explanation is harmonic release. After prolonged tension, even modest resolution feels enormous. The brain interprets contrast as meaning. Still, the restraint here is striking. If this were meant to be triumphant, it would announce itself. Instead, it holds back. That has led to speculation that the band intentionally avoided grandeur, almost as if they didn't trust it. Historically, that tracks. Publicly declaring an ending would have invited scrutiny, blame, and finality. Musically softening it allowed ambiguity to do the work. There's also a subtle shift in perspective. Earlier sections felt inward, confessions, arguments, reckonings. Here, the focus turns outward. The music seems aware it's being heard. Some listeners describe it as performative calm, a composed face presented to the world. Psychologically, this aligns with impression management. After internal conflict, presentation becomes priority. A more paranormal-leaning claim suggests this part of the medley feels empty, like something essential has already left. Not sadness, absence. The rational explanation is arrangement density. Fewer competing elements create space, and space can read as loss. But emptiness, once perceived, tends to amplify itself. You start listening for what's missing instead of what's there. What makes this section powerful is how it refuses to tell you how to feel. There's no emotional instruction manual. Relief feels tentative. Calm feels conditional. And that uncertainty mirrors the band's real situation. The work was finished. The future wasn't. Scale paragraph, verified numbers. Shorter melodic phrases dominate. Instrumentation thins compared to earlier sections. Fewer lyrical ideas introduced. Harmonic movement slows noticeably. Emotional intensity drops without fully resolving. Some hear this as maturity, a refusal to dramatize. Others hear avoidance. The medley accommodates both because aftermaths are rarely clean. They're quiet, confusing, and unresolved by nature. As this section fades into what feels like final ground, one expectation remains. After everything, control, surrender, reckoning, you expect closure, a door shutting, a definitive statement. But the medley seems to hesitate, and that hesitation raises the final tension. If this isn't the ending, then what exactly are we being prepared to hear next? The final moments of the Abbey Road medley feel decisive at first. There's warmth, balance, a sense that everything has finally landed where it belongs. Many listeners describe it as one of the most satisfying endings in popular music. And yet, the satisfaction is fragile, almost suspiciously so. The prevailing belief is that this ending was designed as closure, a deliberate attempt to leave the listener with peace, regardless of what was happening behind the scenes. Supporters of this view point to how neatly the emotional arc appears to resolve. The grounded explanation is craftsmanship. Endings are engineered to feel good. That doesn't make them dishonest, but it doesn't make them complete either. Others argue the ending functions more like a curtain than a conclusion. It signals that the performance is over, not the story. Historically, that reading holds weight. The band continued to exist legally and financially after the music stopped. Public narratives unfolded long after the final note. Closure, in reality, didn't arrive when the medley ended. It arrived later, unevenly, and not all at once. There's also the persistent feeling that the final section contradicts what came before it. After tension, reckoning, and aftermath, the calm seems almost too clean. Some listeners interpret this as forgiveness. Others hear denial. Psychologically, this split is expected. When art resolves more smoothly than life, the mind questions it. A paranormal-leaning claim suggests the ending feels outside of time, as if it exists separately from the rest of the album. The rational explanation points to simplicity, stripped-down structure, direct phrasing, and stable harmony reduce mental friction. Time feels suspended when the brain stops anticipating change. But suspension can feel unnatural when it arrives suddenly. Scale paragraph, verified numbers. One of the shortest lyrical statements in the medley, minimal chord variation, stable tempo, final note allowed to ring without interruption, no immediate musical response afterward. What makes this ending unforgettable isn't certainty, it's restraint. The medley doesn't insist that everything is fine, it simply stops asking questions. That silence after the final sound does more work than any lyric could. So the secrets of the Abbey Road medley don't live in hidden codes or whispered messages. They live in design, in ambiguity, in the careful balance between what's resolved and what's deliberately left open. And that leaves you with the same choice listeners have faced for decades. Do you hear this ending as a farewell that finally brings peace? Or as a beautifully composed illusion that hides how unfinished everything really was?